Welcome to U.S. History since 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history after Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, The American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on Brown, Montgomery, and the litigation siege against Jim Crow. The core question is this: what did constitutional victory mean when black children still entered segregated schools and black workers still boarded Jim Crow buses? The core competency is to discuss the emergence of organized resistance efforts to racial injustice across the American South.
What does a constitutional victory amount to if a child still walks into a segregated school and a worker still boards a bus under rules designed to humiliate her? Brown and Montgomery belonged together because both asked whether rights could survive contact with local administration. Jim Crow did not live by slogan alone. It lived through school board minutes, district lines, bus seating, customs backed by ordinance, police arrest power, courthouse scheduling, and the white assumption that delay counted as order. A Supreme Court opinion could delegitimize that system. A boycott could starve one part of it. Neither could be understood as pure symbolism. By the early 1950s, black Southerners already knew the problem. School children in Clarendon County, South Carolina, were riding long distances or walking, while white districts ran buses. Parents in Topeka, Kansas could point to neighborhood schools they were barred from using. Black riders in Montgomery, Alabama were paying fares to a city-backed transit system that treated them as necessary revenue and expendable people at the same time. The injury was public, repeated, and official. That is why the civil rights struggle at mid-century looked less like spontaneous uplift than like a siege. Lawyers assembled records, parents accepted retaliation risk, women duplicated leaflets and organized neighborhood communication. Churches became fiscal and social headquarters. Taxi drivers, mechanics, and volunteers turned transportation into a political instrument. White officials answered with legal delay, economic pressure, police harassment, and appeals to local custom. The issue was not whether Americans could identify injustice in the abstract. The issue was whether a disciplined movement could make administration more expensive for segregationists than retreat. Brown attacked the legal fiction that segregation could be constitutional if formally equal. Montgomery attacked the financial and political assumptions that allowed everyday segregation to function. Together, they forced a harder national question. If the state injures people through rulebooks and routine, then moral feeling is too weak a remedy by itself. Someone has to rewrite the rules, and someone has to make non-compliance costly. The order before Brown had deep roots. After Reconstruction, Southern legislatures and local governments rebuilt racial hierarchy through poll taxes, literacy tests, jury exclusions, segregated facilities, and public schools funded on radically unequal terms. Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 supplied federal cover by accepting separate but equal as a constitutional formula. That formula was always fraudulent in practice, but it gave county superintendents, city commissioners, and state legislatures a language of legality. Public schooling made the fraud measurable. White schools often had longer terms, sturdier buildings, newer books, better heating, and higher paid teachers. Black schools in many counties operated with shorter calendars because officials treated black labor needs as more important than black education. Transportation exposed the same hierarchy. White children could be carried by bus, while black children walked. That is why early civil rights plaintiffs often began with practical grievances. The legal language was equal protection, but the lived issue might be miles on a road, school furniture, or a leaking roof. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund understood that this system could not be overturned in one dramatic gesture. Charles Hamilton Houston, and later Thurgood Marshall, used a step-by-step litigation strategy that first targeted graduate and professional schools. Missouri ex rel. Gaines in 1938, Sweat v. Painter in 1950, and McLaurin v. Oklahoma in 1950 exposed the fiction that duplicate institutions could ever provide equal standing. Once courts recognized that status, access, and professional opportunity were distorted by segregation itself, the doctrine of Plessy became easier to corner. Montgomery's bus regime rested on the same mixture of law and routine. City ordinances required racial separation. Drivers controlled seat assignments and could demand that black riders move when the white section filled. Riders paid at the front, often exited, and re-entered through the rear door. Drivers sometimes pulled away before black passengers had re-boarded. The insult was repetitive and public, which is one reason it had organizing value. People who endured the same degradation on the same route were already linked by shared experience. There were alternatives available before confrontation hardened. Black parents could continue pressing for piecemeal equality instead of full desegregation.
City officials in Montgomery could have modified driver behavior or adjusted seating rules while preserving segregation in softer form. Many white moderates preferred that kind of slow management because it protected local authority. Civil rights organizers increasingly judged that gradual adjustment left the central machinery intact. Delay meant another school term, another fare collected, another year in which humiliation remained part of ordinary governance. Brown, for Board of Education, joined cases from Kansas, South Carolina, Virginia, Delaware, and the District of Columbia, and that multi-state structure changed the case. The NAACP did not stumble into one perfect test case. It recruited plaintiffs, coordinated local counsel, financed travel, gathered school board records, and built a record showing that segregation injured black children even where facilities appeared superficially comparable. In Topeka, Oliver Brown and other parents challenged the denial of neighborhood schooling. In Clarendon County, the lawsuit that became Briggs versus Elliott began with a request for bus service. In Prince Edward County, student walkouts under Barbara Johns helped generate Davis versus County School Board. Each case carried local danger because the plaintiffs were naming a system that controlled jobs, credit, schooling, and police contact. Marshall's team used multiple kinds of proof. Fiscal disparities counted, and by the early 1950s, the deeper target was the doctrine itself. The lawyers relied on prior case law, witness testimony, and social science evidence associated with Kenneth and Mamie Clark to argue that legally enforced separation stamped black children with official inferiority. That move was strategic. It shifted the ground from whether southern states had distributed resources fairly to whether the state could ever sort children by race without constitutional injury. Southern officials understood the stakes. If the court said segregation in public education was unconstitutional, the logic would spill toward transportation, parks, libraries, and voting access. School boards, governors, and state attorneys began preparing resistance before the ruling arrived. If local officials could not preserve segregation openly as principle, they would preserve it administratively through pupil placement plans, district manipulation, tuition grants, school closures, and endless compliance delays. Massive resistance was not only a speech posture, it became paperwork, budgets, and procedural obstruction. Montgomery's organizers were working a second front. Rosa Parks had years of movement experience as NAACP secretary and investigator. Joanne Robinson and the Women's Political Council had already documented rider complaints and warned city leaders of possible collective action. After Parks was arrested on December 1, 1955, Robinson and allies used Alabama State College equipment to mimeograph tens of thousands of leaflets calling for a one-day boycott on December 5th. That overnight document run shows how quickly informal grievance could become organized discipline when a local network was ready. The one-day boycott then turned into the Montgomery Improvement Association, formed on December 5th with Martin Luther King Jr. as president. Leadership counted and the deeper achievement was operational. The boycott required a replacement transportation system. Black taxi operators reduced fares to 10 cents until officials used insurance and licensing pressure to drive the rate upward. Churches created dispatch points. Volunteers mapped pickup stations. Drivers maintained cars under constant strain. Fundraisers paid for gasoline, tires, and legal expenses. Domestic workers and laborers walked long distances rather than refill the city's bus revenue stream. Ordinary endurance gave the movement its leverage. White officials answered through attrition rather than swift concession. Police ticketed carpool drivers. Employers threatened black workers. Homes connected to organizers were bombed, including King's House in January 1956. The city sued the boycott leadership under an old anti-boycott statute and indicted dozens of participants. The strategy was clear: turn administrative inconvenience into personal risk until discipline broke. The movement survived because its institutions were redundant. When one driver was harassed, others filled in. When leaders were arrested, churches and neighborhood networks kept communication flowing. The legal challenge to bus segregation moved in parallel. Browder v. Gale, filed in February 1956 on behalf of Aurelia Browder, Susie McDonald, Claudette Colvin, and Mary Louise Smith, attacked bus segregation directly under the 14th Amendment. Claudette Colvin's presence reminds you that movement chronology is never as neat as public memory. She had resisted bus segregation months before Parks, but movement leaders judged that Parks's reputation and standing made the political terrain more manageable. That decision was tactical, not accidental. By November 1956, a federal court ruling against bus segregation was affirmed by the Supreme Court. The boycott ended only after that legal result was secure. That sequence tells you how the movement actually worked. Litigation without the boycott would have lacked the same pressure, publicity, and moral force. The boycott without a constitutional ruling might have forced concessions, yet left the legal basis for segregation standing. Rights were carried forward by overlapping instruments rather than a single pure method. The central line in Brown is direct. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. That word inherently did the heaviest work in the opinion. Earl Warren could have written a narrower statement about unequal funding, inferior buildings, or administrative abuse. He chose language that struck the doctrine itself. In the conference room and then on the page, the court told governors, attorneys general, and school boards that segregation was a constitutional offense carried out by state power. Once the opinion fixed the injury inside the arrangement, school boards lost the old refuge of painted walls, new textbooks, and balanced ledgers. Brown also referred to the effect of segregation on children through a feeling of inferiority that affected motivation and status. Warren chose that phrase under the pressure of unanimity and under the pressure of a country that kept describing segregation as local habit. The sentence gave the opinion doctrinal force and public clarity at the same time. By tying constitutional injury to the state production of inferiority, Brown turned equal protection into language that county officials, newspaper editors, and black parents could all hear as an accusation. The opinion destroyed legitimacy, but Brown, too, in 1955, then allowed implementation with all deliberate speed. Segregationists heard the first phrase as condemnation and the second as opportunity. Delay could now dress itself in judicial vocabulary. Lawyers for school districts, governors, and white citizens' councils seized that gap immediately and translated it into hearings, transfer plans, tuition grants, and closure threats. The movement therefore handled Brown as a blade that cut doctrine while leaving enforcement exposed. Placed next to Montgomery, Brown reads almost like a statement of war aims rather than a full battle plan. It tells you what the Constitution cannot permit. It does not tell you how to keep a plaintiff employed after filing suit, how to carry maids across town for work, or how to stop a driver from calling the police. The movement used the opinion as a blade, but it still had to supply the hands, fuel, routes, and institutional stamina required to cut through local resistance. Brown and Montgomery changed the national field by changing what could plausibly be defended. Segregation no longer looked like ordinary local governance. It looked like a system requiring constitutional apology, police maintenance, and economic punishment. That shift carried into Little Rock, the sit-in campaigns, freedom rides, Birmingham, and Selma. Each later confrontation inherited the lesson that rights on paper and rights in operation are different things. The harder consequence was escalation. White citizens' councils grew. State officials refined delay tactics. Federal responsibility became harder to avoid because local governments repeatedly showed that they would not yield equal citizenship on their own. The movement's victories therefore strengthened a version of democracy that depended more heavily on courts, federal enforcement, and national visibility. That was a gain, but it was also an admission about the weakness of local justice, where local power was built around racial control. Brown raised the legal cost of segregation. Montgomery raised the fiscal and political cost of segregation. The pair left no clean exit. If constitutional rights require organized disruption before officials will respect them, then the Republic is already confessing that principle alone is too weak. If organized disruption succeeds only when courts eventually certify it, then mass action is admitting that leverage without law can be isolated. The movement advanced by refusing to choose comfort over that contradiction, and the contradiction is still sitting there waiting on anyone who wants to praise democracy without paying for enforcement.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.